Mary had always believed that, at 75 years old, the most she could expect from life was the respect of those she'd helped raise. Instead, she received an eviction notice and the cold stares of people who'd never understood the meaning of sacrifice. Evicted from her own home by her own children, with nothing but an old suitcase and a promise her grandmother had made 50 years ago when Mary was just 25, she walked alone to the old basement at the back of the abandoned property, a place her family had always called useless junk, but that Mary had always called sanctuary. Her children laughed cruelly when they saw her descend those damp, dark stairs. They thought she was hiding in her own defeat, that she'd finally accepted her place as the family's shame. Little did they know that by breaking the rusted seal on that basement locked for decades, Mary wasn't just opening a dusty door. She was awakening a past the entire town had spent 40 years desperately trying to bury. What Mary found inside that dust-covered oak chest wasn't glittering jewels or hidden stacks of money. It was something infinitely more powerful, a wedding dress that was never worn, and yellowed letters that would bring the powerful people who'd evicted and humiliated her to their knees, begging for forgiveness before sunset. If you've ever been judged unfairly, if you've ever carried the weight of lies others told about you, if you've ever felt your reputation was stolen and never recovered, this story is for you. Prepare to discover what happens when a 75-year-old woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose finds the secret her grandmother kept with love to save her on the darkest day of her life. Subscribe now, because what Mary does with this truth will make you believe it's never ever too late to clear your name and reclaim your dignity. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Mary Elizabeth Sullivan stood on the sidewalk outside the house where she'd lived for 23 years, watching her children load the last of her belongings into a donation truck. Not their truck, a donation truck operated by strangers who would sort through her life and decide what was worth keeping and what deserved to be thrown away. They weren't even keeping her things, weren't storing them in case she might need them later. They were donating everything like she was already gone, already someone who didn't matter anymore. She was 75 years old, and her own children were treating her like an inconvenience to be disposed of as quickly and efficiently as possible. "Mum, you really need to move now," Robert said without looking at her, his voice flat and businesslike, the same tone he probably used with difficult clients at his law firm. He was 50 years old, her oldest son, the baby she'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, and he couldn't even meet her eyes. "The new owners are coming tomorrow morning to start renovations. You can't be here when they arrive. It'll be awkward for everyone." Awkward, that was the word he chose, not tragic, not unjust, not heartbreaking. Awkward. Mary looked at the house, a modest two-story structure with peeling yellow paint and an overgrown garden she'd tended as well as she could with her aging body. It wasn't much, hadn't ever been grand or impressive, but it had been hers for 23 years, or at least she'd thought it was hers in the way that mattered. She'd lived there since her husband Thomas died, paying rent faithfully every single month to the elderly landlord, who'd seemed kind enough, who'd told her she could stay as long as she needed, that he understood what it was like to be alone. She'd never missed a payment in 2 decades, had kept the place clean and maintained despite her limited income from seamstress work. But 3 months ago, the landlord had passed away peacefully in his sleep at 92. His daughter, a woman Mary had never met who lived in California and saw the property only as a financial asset, had immediately sold it to developers who planned to tear it down and build something modern and profitable. And Mary, who'd never had a formal lease, just a handshake agreement with a man now gone, just a verbal promise that meant nothing in the eyes of the law, had no legal right to stay. Her children could have helped her fight it, could have hired a lawyer to at least delay the eviction, could have argued for tenant rights or demanded more time to find alternative housing, could have helped her search for a new place to live, driven her to viewings, co-signed a lease. Instead, they'd shrugged and said it was probably for the best that she moved into some kind of facility where she'd be properly taken care of by people trained for that sort of thing. As if she was an object requiring specialized handling rather than their mother who'd devoted her entire life to raising them. Mary had refused absolutely. She wasn't going to some facility to sit in a communal room playing bingo while waiting to die, wasn't going to surrender the last shreds of her independence and dignity to become another elderly person warehoused until death. So her children had simply stopped helping, stopped calling, except to ask when she'd be out, stopped visiting, started treating her like she was already gone, already erased from their lives. And now here she was, standing on a sidewalk that wouldn't be hers in 24 hours, watching strangers carry away 40 years of accumulated possessions, while her children supervised with the detached efficiency of people clearing out a storage unit. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Mary asked quietly, trying to keep her voice steady even though her chest felt tight with suppressed panic and grief. Sarah, her 48-year-old daughter, finally looked at her with barely concealed exasperation, mixed with what might have been guilt, but looked more like irritation at being made to feel guilty. "Mom, we've been over this 100 times. You can't stay with any of us. We literally don't have room. Michael has the new baby and his house is already crowded. I have my career and I travel constantly for work. Robert's house is too small, and Linda has made it very clear she doesn't want long-term house guests. We're not being mean. We're being realistic. We told you months ago to apply for senior housing." "I did apply," Mary said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "I applied to every single facility within 30 miles. There's a waiting list for all of them. 9 months minimum, most of them over a year. They told me that explicitly. I can't just magically make a space appear." "Well, that's not our fault, is it?" Robert snapped, his patience, what little he'd started with, clearly exhausted. "You should have planned better, Mum. You should have saved money over the years, should have had something in place for emergencies. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead, without building any kind of financial security. Actions have consequences." The words landed like physical blows, each one carrying 40 years of accumulated resentment that Mary hadn't fully understood until this moment. Her children blamed her for being poor, blamed her for not having savings and backup plans and safety nets, blamed her for the crime of having devoted every dollar and every ounce of energy to raising them instead of building a fortress of financial security for her old age. "I have somewhere to go," Mary said suddenly, the words coming out before she'd fully formed the thought, desperation creating an escape plan in real time. "Grandma Eleanor's old property. The main house is gone, but the land is still in the family trust. There's a basement structure in the back built into the hillside. It's still standing. I can stay there." Her children looked at each other and actually laughed. Not nervous laughter or uncomfortable chuckling, but genuine amusement at what they clearly considered a ridiculous idea. "That old dump," Michael, her youngest at 45, spoke for the first time all morning, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone his siblings had mastered. "Mom, that place has been abandoned for 15 years since the house burned down. There's no electricity, no running water, probably no roof left that doesn't leak. You can't seriously think you can live there. It's not even a house anymore, just a hole in the ground." "I'm not asking your permission," Mary interrupted, and something in her voice made all three of them stop and actually look at her for the first time that morning. "I'm telling you where I'll be. If you need me for anything, though I sincerely doubt you will, that's where I'll be. If you ever decide you actually care what happens to me, you'll know where to find me. Not that I'm holding my breath waiting for that particular miracle." She picked up her single suitcase, the only thing they'd agreed to let her keep from an entire household of possessions, and started walking down the sidewalk. She didn't look back to see if they were watching. She didn't want to see if they cared, didn't want to witness their relief that the difficult problem of their elderly mother had finally solved itself through her own exile. Behind her, she heard Robert's voice, dismissive and cold, and carrying clearly in the morning air. "Let her go. Give her a week, maybe 2 at most. She'll come crawling back when she realizes she can't handle living in a basement like some kind of homeless person. Then maybe she'll be reasonable about accepting a facility placement instead of making everything so difficult." Mary kept walking, each step taking her away from the children who'd failed her in every way that mattered, and toward a place she hadn't visited in 50 years. Toward a promise her grandmother had made in a whisper on her deathbed, words that had seemed meaningless at the time, but that Mary had nevertheless remembered. "When you have nowhere left to go, when you've lost everything, go to the sanctuary. I left you something there, something important, something that will save you when you need it most. Promise me you'll remember, Mary. Promise me." Mary had promised, holding her dying grandmother's hand and thinking it was just the rambling of someone whose mind was fading. And now, 50 years later, she was finally going to find out what Eleanor Hayes had meant. The property that had once belonged to Eleanor Hayes sat exactly 3 miles outside of Riverside, North Carolina, far enough from town to feel truly isolated, close enough that Mary could walk there in just under 90 minutes if she moved slowly and carefully. The main house had burned down 15 years ago in an electrical fire that destroyed everything above ground, leaving nothing but a charred foundation that nature had gradually reclaimed. The insurance money had gone into the family trust, divided among Eleanor's descendants according to a complicated legal arrangement. Mary had received her small share, maybe $8,000, which she'd immediately spent on medical bills after Thomas died of cancer. The land itself had sat empty and untouched since then, too rural and too damaged to attract buyers, too legally complicated to develop or sell. The family trust had paid minimal property taxes to keep it from being seized by the county, but nobody had visited in years. Nobody except Mary, apparently, even remembered it existed as anything other than a line item in an accounting ledger. But Mary remembered the basement. Not a basement under the house, but a completely separate structure. A root cellar that Eleanor's husband had built sometime in the early 1940s, dug deep into the hillside behind where the house had stood. It was an old-fashioned design, the kind of storage space people had created before reliable refrigeration, meant to keep vegetables and preserves cool through the summer and from freezing in winter. Eleanor had used it for exactly that purpose, but she'd also treated it as something more, a private space, a place that was entirely hers. My sanctuary, Eleanor used to call it, with a particular emphasis that suggested it meant more than just a storage room. The only place that's entirely mine, where I can think and breathe and be myself without anyone watching or judging or needing something from me. Mary had been 25 years old the last time she'd visited that sanctuary, just before her life had fallen apart in ways she couldn't have imagined, just before the scandal that had destroyed her reputation and nearly destroyed her entirely. She'd blocked out most of those memories deliberately, the pain too deep and too sharp to examine without breaking. But now, walking up the overgrown path toward where the house had once stood, she let herself remember piece by piece. The house was gone completely, nothing remaining except a concrete foundation overtaken by aggressive weeds and small trees that had taken root in the cracks. Nature had reclaimed the space enthusiastically, erasing almost all evidence that humans had ever lived there. But beyond the foundation, built into the hillside exactly as she remembered, was the basement entrance, a heavy wooden door set into mortared stone, weathered and moss-covered, but still fundamentally solid. Mary approached it slowly, her heart pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The door was smaller than she remembered, but everything from childhood memory seemed larger than reality. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, covered in decades of oxidation, looking like it might disintegrate if touched. Mary reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something she'd kept for 50 years without fully understanding why. A small brass key on a tarnished chain that her grandmother had pressed into her palm the day before she died, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "For the sanctuary," Eleanor had whispered, her voice barely audible but intense with urgency. "When you need it most. When you have nothing left. Remember, Mary. Promise me you'll remember." Mary's hands shook badly as she fitted the key into the padlock. It stuck at first, decades of rust and corrosion fighting against her, but she twisted harder, using both hands and all her remaining strength. With a grinding screech that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, the lock opened. The door itself was much harder. Swollen with moisture and age, warped by decades of weather, it took all of Mary's strength to pull it open even an inch. She braced her feet, grabbed the old iron handle with both hands and pulled with everything she had. The door fought her, groaning in protest, but finally gave way with a sound like tearing fabric. A cloud of musty air rushed out when the door opened, carrying the scent of earth and old wood and something else, something faint but unmistakable. Lavender. Eleanor's scent. The smell she'd carried with her always, that had perfumed her clothes and her hair, and had seemed to fill any room she entered. Mary pulled a small flashlight from her suitcase, one of the few practical items her children had allowed her to keep, and clicked it on with fingers that trembled. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was larger than she'd remembered, stretching back into the hillside with a curved ceiling of mortared stone and heavy timber beams. Shelves lined the walls on both sides, most completely empty now, some still holding ancient mason jars covered in dust and cobwebs, their contents long since spoiled and forgotten. But at the very back of the basement, illuminated clearly in her flashlight beam, sat a large trunk, dark wood bound with brass fittings, exactly as she remembered it from childhood, Eleanor's hope chest. The trunk she'd brought with her when she'd immigrated to America from Ireland in 1920, carrying everything she owned in the world. The trunk that had held her most precious possessions, wedding dress, family photographs, documents, treasures. Mary walked toward it slowly, her flashlight beam steady despite her trembling hands. She could barely breathe, could barely think past the pounding of her heart. The trunk was sealed with red wax, the seal unbroken after all these years, perfectly preserved, and pressed into the wax was Eleanor's cameo ring, the one she'd worn every single day of her life, the one she'd been buried without because she'd secretly taken it off beforehand and hidden it here. This wasn't just locked away. This was sealed, preserved, protected, meant to last decades, meant to be found at exactly the right moment. Mary set down her flashlight carefully, positioning it so the beam illuminated the trunk fully. Then, with hands that had done delicate seamstress work for 50 years, hands that knew how to be gentle and precise, she carefully broke the wax seal. The lid was heavy, solid wood that hadn't warped despite the decades, but it opened smoothly on hinges that had been well made and had lasted. And there, filling the trunk completely, preserved carefully in layers of tissue paper and scattered lavender sachets, was a wedding dress. Not just any wedding dress. Mary's wedding dress. The one she had made with her own hands but had never worn. The one from the wedding that had been cancelled because of lies and scandal and cruelty. The one that represented the happy beginning that had been stolen from her 40 years ago. Mary stared at the dress, unable to breathe, unable to think, as 40 years of carefully suppressed memories came flooding back with crushing, overwhelming force. She'd been 35 years old, working as a seamstress in Riverside, when she'd met Thomas Sullivan. She'd been running a small alterations business from her tiny apartment, taking in work from the few people in town willing to employ that woman, the one with the scandalous past that everyone whispered about, but nobody would explain to her face. Thomas had come to her shop one autumn afternoon with a request to alter his late wife's wedding dress for his niece's upcoming wedding. He'd been a widower for 3 years, 45 years old with grown children, working as a carpenter with gentle hands and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. They'd started talking during the fitting appointments. He'd told her about his wife, who'd passed away from a sudden illness, about his loneliness, about how hard it was to navigate the world as a single person after decades of partnership. She'd told him about her work, about her love of fabric and design, carefully avoiding the parts of her past that still hurt too much to discuss. He'd asked her to dinner. She'd said yes, surprising herself. Within 6 months, they were engaged, and Mary had been so happy she could barely believe it was real. She'd been alone for so long, judged and whispered about, and isolated for reasons she'd tried desperately not to think about. But Thomas had looked past whatever rumors circulated about her, had chosen to know her for who she was, rather than who people said she'd been. She'd made her own wedding dress, pouring all her skill and hope and desperate longing for a fresh start into every single stitch. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever created, ivory silk with delicate lace applique, fitted bodice and flowing skirt, elegant and timeless. The wedding was set for June 15th, 1985. The church was booked, Riverside Community Church, the largest and most respected in town. Invitations had been sent, flowers ordered, a small reception planned. And then Pastor Daniel Morrison had destroyed everything with calculated, deliberate cruelty. He'd been 40 years old, married with 3 children, the beloved and charismatic leader of Riverside Community Church, where Mary and Thomas had planned to wed. He'd been handsome and charming and powerful, a man whose opinion mattered, whose word carried weight, whose approval or disapproval could make or break reputations in a small town like Riverside. And he decided he wanted Mary. She'd first noticed it during the wedding planning meetings, compliments that lasted too long, touches that lingered inappropriately, looks that made her deeply uncomfortable. Then corners where he'd somehow managed to trap her alone, whispering things that made her skin crawl, suggesting she should be grateful for his attention, that she should meet him privately to discuss the ceremony, that no one would have to know about their special friendship. Mary had refused him every single time, firmly and clearly, and increasingly desperately. She'd thought about reporting him, but to whom? He was the pastor. He had all the power. Who would believe her accusations against him? So she'd simply tried to avoid him, hoping that her clear rejections would be enough, that he would give up and leave her alone, that she could just get through the wedding and then never have to deal with him again. She'd been naive. She'd been catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. 2 weeks before the wedding, Pastor Morrison had gone to the church elders with a story he'd carefully crafted and rehearsed. He'd told them with tears in his eyes and a voice shaking with what appeared to be righteous anger and betrayed trust, that Mary Sullivan had come to his office and inappropriately propositioned him, that she'd been aggressive and inappropriate, suggesting they have an affair, telling him she was attracted to him and didn't care that he was married, that he'd firmly rejected her advances and told her such behavior was sinful, that she'd become angry and threatening when he'd refused her. He'd said he felt duty-bound to inform the community about her true character before she married an innocent man in God's house. He'd performed his lie perfectly, a master manipulator who knew exactly how to appear wounded and reluctant and painfully honest. And the elders had believed him instantly and completely. A powerful, respected pastor versus a seamstress with no family in town and a past that nobody quite understood. There was no question whom they'd trust, no doubt about whose word carried more weight. Within 24 hours, the story had spread through Riverside like wildfire. The wedding was cancelled by the church. Thomas's family, pillars of the community and faithful church members, begged him to break the engagement. When he refused, choosing to believe Mary over the rumors, his own mother threatened to disown him completely. Most of Riverside turned against Mary overnight, calling her horrible names in the street, refusing her business, treating her like she was morally contaminated. Thomas's family essentially forced him to make an impossible choice: Mary or them, love or family, faith or scandal. And Thomas, bless him, had believed Mary was innocent. He'd insisted they marry anyway, quietly, at the county courthouse without family or celebration or the church ceremony they'd planned. They'd had 30 years together after that, 30 years of being outsiders in Riverside, of being the couple people whispered about, of Mary being known forever as that woman who threw herself at the pastor. Even their children, raised with this story as the background noise of their entire lives, had grown up with subtle shame about their mother's reputation. They'd never quite believed her version of events, never quite trusted her, never quite been able to defend her when people whispered. And when Thomas had finally died of cancer 23 years ago, leaving Mary alone, that old scandal had resurged with renewed vigor, making her more isolated than ever, more judged, more alone. Now, staring at the wedding dress that represented the happy beginning that had been stolen from her, Mary felt 40 years of buried pain rising up from the place where she'd forced it down and locked it away. She'd carried this injustice for 4 decades. She'd lived with the shame, the judgment, the knowledge that a powerful man had lied and everyone had believed him, and there was nothing she could do about it. Her hands shook as she lifted the dress carefully from the trunk, the fabric still beautiful despite its age, the ivory silk preserved perfectly by Eleanor's careful packing. But as she lifted it, something felt wrong. The lining was thicker and stiffer than it should have been, something that didn't belong. Mary turned the dress over with her seamstress's expert eye, examining the seams and construction. There, in the bodice lining, a section that had been opened and re-sewn. Not her stitching, which she would have recognized instantly, someone else's work, careful and skilled, but different, hidden. With hands that had steadied with purpose and focus, Mary found her sewing scissors in her suitcase and carefully, methodically, cut the restitched seam. The lining fell open, and several envelopes tumbled into her lap. Old envelopes, yellowed with decades, addressed in different hands to Eleanor Hayes. Mary picked up the first envelope with shaking hands, barely breathing. It was postmarked August 1985, just 2 months after the scandal that had destroyed her life. She opened it with careful reverence and unfolded the fragile paper inside. Dear Mrs. Hayes, I am writing this letter because I cannot bear the weight of guilt and silence any longer, even though I am far too afraid to speak these truths publicly where they might actually matter. I was Pastor Daniel Morrison's secretary for 15 years. I worked in the church office, handling correspondence and appointments and maintaining records. I was there in the office on the day he claims Mary Sullivan came to him and propositioned him inappropriately. I know the truth of what actually happened that day. He called her into his office. I made the appointment myself at his request. I heard him through the door saying inappropriate things to her, heard his voice take on a tone I recognized because I'd heard it before with other women. I heard her clearly and firmly tell him no, heard her say she was engaged to be married and was leaving. I heard her leave quickly. He was angry when she left. I could see it in his face when he came out of his office. And within an hour he was crafting the story he would tell the elders, practicing it in his office, where he thought no one could hear him through the walls. I heard everything. I heard him create the lie that would destroy her. I wanted desperately to speak up, to tell someone what I'd witnessed, to defend that poor woman who was being destroyed by lies. But Pastor Morrison controls so much in this town. My husband works for a company where the pastor sits on the board of directors. If I speak against him publicly, We'll lose everything, my husband's job, our home, our security. I have 3 children to feed and protect. I'm ashamed of my cowardice, Mrs. Hayes. I'm ashamed that I'm choosing my family's safety over defending an innocent woman. But I cannot find the courage to sacrifice everything, even though I know it's the right thing to do. I'm sending you this letter because I heard through town connections that you're Mary's grandmother, and I hope that somehow this truth can help her, even if I cannot speak it myself where others can hear. Mary Sullivan is completely innocent. Pastor Morrison is lying deliberately and maliciously. Everything he's accused her of doing, he actually did to her. Please forgive me for not being brave enough to say this where it would matter. Please know that at least one person in this town knows the truth and carries the guilt of silence. A friend who knows the truth. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she finished reading. Evidence. After 40 years, actual evidence that she'd been telling the truth all along. Someone had witnessed the reality and documented it, even if they'd been too afraid to speak publicly. With trembling hands, she grabbed the second envelope. This one also addressed to Eleanor Hayes, but in completely different handwriting, postmarked September 1985. Dear Eleanor, I need you to know what I witnessed, even though I'm too much of a coward to say these things, where they might help the woman who needs this testimony. I was walking past Riverside Community Church late one evening in early May. I'd been working late at my office downtown and was cutting through the church parking lot as a shortcut to my car. I saw Pastor Morrison following Mary Sullivan to her car in the parking lot. She was clearly trying to leave, walking quickly, but he followed her and cornered her by her vehicle. I was too far away to hear their conversation clearly, but I watched him touch her arm repeatedly when she tried to move past him, saw him position himself to block her path, saw him lean in close in a way that was clearly inappropriate and unwanted. I saw her push his hand away and finally managed to get into her car and drive away quickly. This was several weeks before the scandal broke publicly. I realize now, seeing how everything unfolded, that he was pursuing her persistently and inappropriately, and when she continued to reject him firmly, he destroyed her reputation to protect his own. I wanted desperately to testify to what I'd seen, to defend her publicly, to tell everyone that Morrison was the aggressor and Mary was the victim, but my wife reminded me that we have significant business dealings with several prominent church members. Standing against the pastor publicly would ruin us financially and socially. My wife threatened to leave me if I got involved, said I had no right to risk our family's security for a stranger. I hate myself for this cowardice, Eleanor. I hate that I'm choosing financial security over defending an innocent woman, but I have children to provide for and a business to protect. I'm sending you this letter as a record of truth, even though I lack the courage to speak it publicly. Maybe somehow, someday it will matter. Maybe somehow it will help Mary prove her innocence, even if that day comes far too late. Your friend in shame and regret, James Whitmore. Mary stared at the letter, at the name signed clearly at the bottom, and felt something like hope beginning to kindle beneath 40 years of accumulated pain. 2 witnesses, 2 people who'd seen the truth and documented it, even if they'd been too afraid to speak publicly. But there was one more envelope, larger than the others, and this one was addressed in handwriting Mary recognized instantly. Her grandmother's elegant script, slightly shaky with age, but still distinctive. Addressed simply, to my beloved Mary. Mary opened this final letter with tears already streaming down her face, knowing somehow that this would be the hardest one to read. My dearest, precious Mary, if you're reading this letter, then I'm gone from this world, and you finally found your way to the sanctuary like I begged you to remember. I'm so sorry it took you this long to come here. I'm sorry for whatever pain and hardship led you to finally open this trunk. And I'm desperately, profoundly sorry that I couldn't give you these letters when they would have mattered most, when they might have cleared your name and saved your reputation and prevented 40 years of unjust suffering. By the time these letters found their way to me, carried by people too afraid to speak publicly, but unwilling to remain completely silent, the immediate damage was already done. The scandal had already spread like wildfire through Riverside. The church wedding had already been cancelled. Thomas's family had already turned against you. You and Thomas had already married quietly at the courthouse, already been cast out by Riverside society and marked as scandal. I wanted so desperately to give you these letters immediately, to march into that church and shove the truth directly into Pastor Morrison's lying face, to force the elders to acknowledge they'd been wrong, to make the whole town see that you were innocent. I made appointments with 3 of the church elders, preparing to present this evidence and demand they clear your name publicly. But then, Pastor Morrison found out I had evidence against him. I still don't know how he learned about it. Perhaps one of the letter writer's guilt led them to confess to someone. Perhaps he simply had enough power and connections to learn everything that happened in Riverside. But he came to my house personally one evening when I was alone. He was a powerful, frightening man when he wanted to be, Mary. He told me in very clear terms that if I tried to use those letters publicly, if I attempted to challenge his word or damage his reputation, he would dedicate himself to destroying what remained of your life completely and thoroughly. He said he would spread even worse rumors, would make sure you could never work in this county again, would make sure Thomas lost his carpentry business, would make your existence so unbearable that you'd wish you'd never been born. He said it calmly, almost pleasantly, like he was discussing the weather rather than threatening to ruin your entire life. And Mary, I believed him completely. He had that kind of power in Riverside. He had connections and influence, and the unshakable trust of people who mattered. He could have done everything he threatened and more. I was an old woman, already past 70. You were newly married, trying desperately to build some kind of life with Thomas despite everything that had happened. I thought, perhaps foolishly, perhaps correctly, I'll never know, that if I stayed quiet and hid the evidence, at least you could have some measure of peace and privacy to build your marriage. I thought that protecting you meant hiding the truth, rather than fighting with it, and risking even worse consequences. So I sewed these letters into the lining of the wedding dress you never got to wear for the wedding that never happened, and I sealed them away in this sanctuary where only you would eventually find them. I hoped desperately that you'd never need them, that life would be kind to you, that the scandal would gradually fade into irrelevant history, that eventually the truth wouldn't matter, because you'd be happy and safe and surrounded by people who loved you. But I'm writing this final letter on my deathbed, and I'm realistic enough to prepare for darker possibilities. If you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. You've lost Thomas, or your children have failed you, or you've lost your home and security. You're alone and desperate, and you need weapons to fight back against a world that's been unjust to you. So here they are, my darling girl, the truth. The evidence that you were completely innocent and that a powerful, cruel man destroyed your reputation to protect himself. The testimony of witnesses who saw what really happened but were too afraid to speak publicly. I don't know if Pastor Morrison is still alive when you read this. I hope he's long dead and facing whatever judgment awaits liars and abusers. I don't know if the people who believed his lies are still around to hear the truth. I don't know if clearing your name 40 years late will bring you any peace or justice. But I know this with absolute certainty. You deserved so much better than what happened to you. You deserved to have these letters 40 years ago. You deserve to have your name cleared publicly and your reputation restored. You deserve to wear this dress at a beautiful wedding in a church filled with people who loved you. I failed you by staying silent when I should have fought. I chose caution over courage, and you paid the price for my cowardice. I can never apologize enough for that failure. But maybe, even this late, truth can still matter. Maybe evidence can still make a difference. Maybe justice delayed is still worth pursuing. Use these letters, Mary. Tell the truth publicly. Make people listen to evidence instead of rumors. If there's any justice left in this world, any decency, any fairness, let it finally find you. I love you more than I ever found words to express. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough when bravery mattered most, but maybe my cowardice can be redeemed if this truth eventually helps you reclaim the dignity that was stolen. Your grandmother who failed you but never stopped loving you, Eleanor Hayes. Mary sat in that basement with her grandmother's letter in her hands, with the wedding dress she'd never worn spread across her lap, with evidence of her innocence finally in her possession after 40 years, and she cried. She cried for the young woman she'd been who'd had her reputation destroyed by lies. She cried for the grandmother who'd wanted to help but had been too afraid. She cried for 40 years of carrying shame she'd never deserved, of being whispered about and judged and isolated. She cried until she had no more tears, until the grief and rage and pain had poured out of her and left her empty and somehow, strangely, clear-headed. Then, with her tears still drying on her weathered face, she carefully gathered the letters, folded them into her coat pocket, and stood up. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple through the open basement door, and Mary Elizabeth Sullivan had work to do before nightfall. Because Pastor Daniel Morrison, she knew from occasional town gossip that still reached even her isolated life, was still alive, still living in Riverside, still respected and admired, still powerful. And tomorrow was Sunday, which meant tomorrow the whole town would be gathered in one place, and Mary had a truth to tell that was 40 years overdue. Mary spent that night in the basement sanctuary, wrapped in old blankets she'd found in her suitcase, planning her approach with the careful precision of someone who'd spent 50 years doing detail-oriented seamstress work. She'd lived in Riverside long enough to understand exactly how the town worked, knew when people gathered, knew where crowds assembled, knew how to create a moment that people couldn't ignore or dismiss. Sunday service at Riverside Community Church began at 10 o'clock in the morning, but before service, at 9 o'clock sharp, there was fellowship hour in the town square, a beloved tradition where church members and townspeople gathered around coffee and pastries for socializing before heading to worship together. It would be crowded with people, public and visible, full of potential witnesses, perfect for what Mary needed to do. But Mary understood something crucial. She needed to look like someone who deserved to be heard. The problem was, she had nothing. The clothes she'd been allowed to keep were worn and shabby, the belongings of a poor elderly woman who looked exactly like what she was, desperate, evicted, homeless. No one would listen to someone who looked defeated and powerless. They'd dismiss her as confused or crazy or simply irrelevant. She needed to look dignified, needed to present herself as someone whose words carried weight and whose truth mattered. She needed to look like the woman she'd been before the scandal destroyed her, confident, capable, someone who demanded respect simply by existing. Mary examined the wedding dress carefully in the beam of her flashlight, running her experienced fingers over the fabric and construction. It was 40 years old, but Eleanor's meticulous preservation had kept it remarkably beautiful. The ivory silk still had its soft luster. The delicate lace appliqué still held its intricate pattern. The fitted bodice and flowing skirt were classic enough that they didn't look absurdly dated. It was clearly a wedding dress, yes, and wearing a wedding dress to confront her accuser might seem theatrical or strange, but it was also the most dignified, beautiful, powerful garment Mary owned. And there was a symbolic rightness to wearing the dress she'd never gotten to wear to the wedding that had been stolen from her, wearing evidence of what had been taken as armor while she reclaimed what was owed. With her seamstress's considerable skill, Mary could modify the dress to make it less obviously bridal while keeping its dignity and beauty intact. She worked through the night by flashlight, her elderly fingers still surprisingly nimble and precise from 50 years of detailed needlework. She carefully removed the train, shortening the back to a more practical length. She detached the veil completely. She altered the neckline to be less romantic and more severe, more businesslike. She found an old shawl she'd kept in her suitcase and modified it to drape over her shoulders like a dignified wrap. By the time dawn light began filtering through the basement door, she had created something remarkable, a dress that no longer screamed wedding, but instead whispered dignity, grace, intention, importance. A dress that said its wearer was someone who mattered, someone who had taken care with her appearance, because she had something important to say. Mary bathed as best she could using water from a jug she'd filled at a public water pump the previous evening, taking care to be as clean and presentable as possible. She did her hair carefully, pinning her white curls into a neat, elegant style that added to, rather than detracted from her age. She dressed in the modified gown, and when she examined herself in a small compact mirror, she saw not a defeated elderly woman, but someone who looked like she had profound truths to speak and the strength to speak them. At 8:45 in the morning, Mary Elizabeth Sullivan walked toward Riverside's town square, carrying the 3 letters in a simple cloth bag, wearing a modified wedding dress that was 40 years old, heading toward a confrontation that was 4 decades overdue. The square was already filling with people when she arrived, church members and families, young and old, gathering in the pleasant morning sunshine with coffee cups and conversations. She saw familiar faces everywhere, people who'd judged her 40 years ago, people who'd whispered about her and turned away from her, and denied her their respect and their business. She saw her own 3 children there, Robert and Sarah and Michael, standing with their respective families, coffee cups in hand, laughing about something. They hadn't noticed her yet, hadn't seen their evicted mother approaching in a vintage gown, and at the center of one of the largest groups, holding court like the beloved elder statesman he'd successfully pretended to be for decades, stood Pastor Daniel Morrison. He was 78 years old now, white-haired and slightly stooped with age, but still possessing that charismatic presence that had made him so powerful and dangerous. People clustered around him attentively, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, treating him like the respected community treasure he'd never actually been. Mary walked straight toward him through the crowd, moving with purpose and dignity. People noticed her dress first. The unusual vintage beauty of it made heads turn, made conversations pause. Then they began recognizing her face, and whispers started spreading through the square like ripples across water. "Is that Mary Sullivan? What is she doing here dressed like that? Why would she come to fellowship hour? Someone should probably call security." Mary stopped directly in front of Pastor Morrison, close enough that he had to look at her, close enough that everyone around could hear what she was about to say. He looked up, saw her standing there, and for just one fraction of a second before he controlled his expression, she saw genuine fear flash across his face. He recognized her. He recognized the dress, or at least what it represented, and he was afraid of what she might say. "Pastor Morrison," Mary said clearly, her voice carrying through the increasingly quiet square, "I have something that belongs to you, something that's been waiting 40 years to be delivered to you publicly." She reached into her bag and pulled out the 3 letters, holding them up so the assembled crowd could see them clearly. "40 years ago," Mary continued, her voice steady and strong despite her racing heart, "you told this town that I had inappropriately propositioned you. You claimed I had tried to seduce you, that I had behaved inappropriately toward you. You said I was a woman of poor character who shouldn't be allowed to marry in your church, and this town believed you without question because you were a pastor, powerful and respected and trusted, and I was just a seamstress with no family connections, because you were important, and I was nobody." The crowd was completely silent now, every person watching, conversations dying as people turned their full attention to this unexpected drama. "But you lied," Mary said, looking directly at Morrison's pale face. "You pursued me. You cornered me in your office and made inappropriate suggestions. You followed me to my car in the parking lot and touched me when I tried to leave. You made me deeply uncomfortable repeatedly. And when I rejected you, clearly, firmly, repeatedly, you were angry. So you decided to destroy my reputation before I could damage yours. You lied to protect yourself, and you destroyed my life to save your own." "This is absolutely ridiculous," Morrison said, but his voice was shaking slightly, lacking the confident authority he usually commanded. "This woman has been telling these same lies for 40 years. She's clearly disturbed and confused. Someone really should—" "I have evidence," Mary interrupted, her voice cutting cleanly through his attempted dismissal. "I have letters from people who witnessed the truth, people who saw what you actually did, people who were too afraid of you 40 years ago to speak publicly, but who documented the truth because their consciences wouldn't allow them to remain completely silent while you destroyed an innocent woman." She held up the first letter, the one from Morrison's secretary. "Your own secretary witnessed you calling me into your office. She heard you saying inappropriate things to me through the door. She heard me clearly telling you no, heard me say I was engaged and leaving. She heard you being angry when I rejected you, and she heard you crafting your lies afterward, practicing the story you would tell to destroy me." Morrison's face had gone from pale to grey, the colour draining as he realised she had actual evidence, actual documentation. "She also witnessed you creating the false narrative in your office when you thought no one could hear you," Mary continued relentlessly. She held up the second letter. "And James Whitmore, a respected businessman in this town 40 years ago, witnessed you following me to the church parking lot one evening. He saw you corner me by my car. He saw you touching me repeatedly when I tried to leave. He saw me push you away before I could finally escape. This was weeks before you publicly accused me. He saw you pursuing me inappropriately, and he documented it even though he was too afraid of your power to testify publicly." She held up the final letter, her grandmother's confession and explanation. "And this letter is from my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. She explains how you threatened her personally when she tried to bring this evidence forward 40 years ago, how you told her you would completely destroy what remained of my life if she dared to challenge your lies publicly, how you used your power and influence to silence an old woman who was trying to protect her granddaughter from injustice." Mary looked around at the crowd, seeing faces she'd known for decades, seeing shock and confusion and the beginning of understanding. "I'm not here asking you to simply take my word over his. I'm here to provide you with documented evidence from multiple witnesses that was silenced by fear and power 40 years ago. I'm here to tell you that an innocent woman had her reputation destroyed, her wedding cancelled, her life nearly ruined, because a powerful man couldn't handle being rejected by someone he considered beneath him. And I'm here to say that I spent 40 years being treated like I was shameful and immoral and untrustworthy, because all of you chose to believe a lie told by someone powerful rather than the truth told by someone without power or protection. She turned back to Morrison, and her voice became quiet but somehow even more powerful in its intensity. I want you to tell the truth, right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses who trusted you and believed you and defended you for 40 years. Did you lie about me? Did you pursue me inappropriately when I was engaged to be married? Did you destroy my reputation because I rejected your advances? Did you steal my wedding and my dignity and 40 years of my life to protect yourself from the consequences of your own inappropriate behavior? The silence was absolute and suffocating. Morrison stood there looking at the letters in Mary's hands, looking at the crowd of people watching him with growing suspicion, looking at the woman he'd tried to destroy 40 years ago, now standing in front of him, dressed in the wedding gown she'd never gotten to wear to the wedding he'd cancelled. And finally, after 40 years of successful deception, his carefully maintained facade cracked and crumbled. His voice broke completely. You don't understand the full situation. I was young and made mistakes, but I had a family to protect, a position in the community. I had to protect. Did you lie? Mary repeated, her voice absolutely unwavering. Did you destroy an innocent woman's life to protect yourself? Yes or no? Morrison looked at her, looked at the letters, looked at the crowd, and something in him finally broke after 4 decades. Yes, he whispered, then louder, his voice cracking. Yes, I pursued you inappropriately. You rejected me repeatedly and clearly. I was angry and felt rejected and humiliated, so I lied to the church elders. I told them you had pursued me when the truth was exactly the opposite. I destroyed your reputation to protect mine. I'm sorry. God help me, I've lived with that guilt for 40 years. The crowd erupted in shocked conversation, voices rising as people turned to each other in disbelief. Mary saw Robert pushing through the crowd toward her, his face absolutely stunned. Mum, he said, his voice barely audible over the growing noise, all these years, you were telling the truth? Everything you said, it was all real? Mary looked at her oldest son with a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. All these years, she confirmed quietly. I tried to tell you. I tried to tell all of you. But you never quite believed me, did you? You never quite trusted that I was innocent. Because a respected pastor had accused me, and I was just your embarrassing mother with the shameful past that you wished would go away. Sarah was crying now, pushing through to reach Mary's side. Mum, I'm so sorry. We should have believed you. We should have defended you. You should have helped me when I was being evicted, Mary said, her voice hard, despite the tears she could feel threatening. You should have cared enough about me to not let me end up homeless at 75, but you didn't. You laughed at me when I came to find shelter in a basement. You assumed I was defeated and pathetic and you walked away, so I had to save myself. I had to find my grandmother's letters and clear my own name and fight my own battle, like I've been doing my entire life, fighting alone because the people who should have stood beside me chose not to. She turned back to the crowd, raising her voice to address everyone gathered. I'm not asking for your money or your pity. I'm not asking for anything except this one simple thing. Let my name be cleared. Let it be known and remembered and acknowledged that Mary Elizabeth Sullivan was innocent of the charges made against her, that she was wrongly accused by a man who abused his power, that she lived 40 years carrying shame she never deserved. Let that be the truth that this town finally acknowledges and accepts. She looked at Morrison one final time, this elderly man who'd stolen so much from her. You get to live with what you did. You get to explain to your children and grandchildren, and this community why you destroyed an innocent woman's life to protect yourself. You get to face whatever conscience you still possess after 40 years of maintaining a lie. But you don't get to keep the lie anymore. The truth is out now, documented and witnessed and undeniable, and it's staying out. Then Mary Elizabeth Sullivan turned and walked away from the crowd, her head held high, the modified wedding dress flowing behind her like a banner of dignity reclaimed. Behind her she heard the eruption of voices, some still defending Morrison, some expressing outrage at him, some calling her name. She heard her children calling after her, their voices urgent and pleading. She didn't stop walking. She didn't turn back. She walked steadily out of the town square, past the gawking faces toward the basement sanctuary, and sat down on the trunk that had held the truth for 40 long years. And for the first time in 4 decades, Mary Elizabeth Sullivan felt something she'd almost forgotten existed, peace that came from justice, and dignity that came from truth, finally spoken and heard. The aftermath came with surprising speed and overwhelming force that Mary had never anticipated. By Sunday evening, someone's cell phone video of Mary's confrontation with Pastor Morrison had gone viral, first locally, then regionally, then spreading nationally through social media with remarkable speed. 75-year-old woman confronts pastor who destroyed her life. 40 years ago, read the headlines from news outlets across the country. Elderly woman provides evidence she was innocent of decades-old scandal, reported others. Pastor finally admits lies that ruined woman's reputation, announced still more. By Monday morning, news crews from 3 different regional stations had tracked Mary down to Eleanor's old property, wanting interviews with the elderly woman living in a basement who'd finally cleared her name after 40 years. Mary let them come. Let them see how her children's abandonment had left her living in a root cellar at 75 years old. Let them document the humble circumstances she'd been reduced to through family rejection. She told her story calmly and clearly, showed them the letters, explained the 40 years of unjust judgment. The story resonated powerfully with audiences. An elderly woman wrongly accused, finally vindicated, abandoned by her own children, living in poverty despite her innocence. People were outraged on her behalf and inspired by her courage. Pastor Daniel Morrison's carefully constructed reputation collapsed literally overnight. The charitable foundation he'd led for the past 15 years demanded his immediate resignation. The church issued a formal public apology to Mary, acknowledging they'd failed her 40 years ago and offering to make whatever amends were possible. People who'd shunned her for decades suddenly wanted to talk to her, wanted to apologize, wanted somehow to make up for 4 decades of unjust treatment. Mary accepted some of these apologies graciously. Others she rejected firmly, having earned through suffering the right to decide who genuinely deserved her forgiveness. Her children came to her on Tuesday, all 3 of them together, looking genuinely ashamed in a way Mary had never seen before. "Mom," Robert began, his voice hoarse like he'd been crying, "we need to talk about everything that happened, about how we treated you, about the eviction and leaving you with nowhere to go, about not believing you for so many years." "Yes," Mary agreed simply. "We do need to talk about all of that." "We found you an apartment," Sarah said quickly, speaking rapidly as if speed would somehow make up for cruelty. "A really nice place, 2 bedrooms, good neighborhood. We'll pay the first year's rent completely, help you move your things, get you furniture, whatever you need." "No," Mary interrupted firmly. "What?" Michael looked genuinely confused. "But you can't stay here in this basement. We're trying to help you now. We're trying to make up for—" "I don't want your guilt money," Mary said clearly. "I don't want you to swoop in now that I've publicly cleared my name and made you look like failures as children. I don't want you to suddenly rescue me because it makes you feel better about yourselves or because you're embarrassed by how bad you look in news coverage." "Then what do you want from us?" Robert asked, and something in his voice suggested he genuinely didn't understand. Mary looked at her 3 children. These people she'd carried and birthed and nursed and raised and sacrificed everything for, and felt a complicated mixture of love and disappointment and hard-won wisdom. "I want you to truly understand something important. For 40 years, you had a choice every single day to believe me or believe the rumors about me. You consistently chose to believe the rumors, even though I was your mother. When I desperately needed help last month, when I was being evicted and had nowhere to go, you had a choice to stand by me or abandon me. You chose abandonment. You laughed at me when I came to this basement for shelter. You assumed I was defeated and pathetic, and you walked away feeling relieved the problem had solved itself." She paused, letting the full weight of that truth settle on them. "I saved myself. I found my grandmother's evidence. I cleared my own name publicly. I stood up in that town square completely alone and fought for my own dignity while you watched from the crowd. Not because you helped me or supported me or believed in me, despite the fact that you didn't do any of those things." "We know," Sarah whispered, tears streaming freely. "We know we failed you completely. That's why we're here. We want to make it right." "You can't make 40 years right," Mary said, not cruelly but simply stating truth. "You can't go back and choose differently when it would have actually mattered. But here's what I want going forward. I want you to know and acknowledge that you failed me profoundly, and I want you to understand that any relationship we have from this point forward is not because I need you or depend on you for survival. It's because I'm choosing, out of grace and forgiveness that you frankly don't deserve, to give you a chance to earn back trust that you destroyed. She looked at each of them in turn. "If you want to be part of my life now, it will be on my terms. Not as my rescuers riding in to save poor, helpless, elderly me, but as my children who owe me a massive debt of respect and trust and care, and who need to work very hard to prove they're capable of providing those things consistently over time." The three of them stood in silence for a long moment, and Mary saw finally what looked like genuine understanding beginning to dawn in their expressions. "Can we earn back your trust?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice breaking. "Can you ever forgive us enough to let us try?" "I don't know," Mary answered honestly, "but you're welcome to try, and we'll see over time whether you're capable of being the children I needed you to be all along." A lawyer had reached out to Mary on Wednesday, pro bono, he'd explained, because her case had moved him deeply after seeing the news coverage. Pastor Morrison, it turned out, had been considerably wealthy through inheritance and careful investments. The lies he'd told about Mary 40 years ago had directly cost her business, income, social connections, and countless opportunities throughout her life. There was, the lawyer explained carefully, a very strong case for a civil lawsuit seeking damages for defamation, emotional distress, and economic harm spanning 4 decades. Mary thought about it carefully overnight, weighing her options and her principles. She wasn't a vindictive person by nature. She'd never wanted revenge, had only wanted truth and dignity. But she was also 75 years old, currently living in a basement with almost nothing to her name, facing years ahead with no financial security. Principle was important, but so was practical survival. "File it," she told the lawyer when he called back Thursday morning. The case moved quickly once filed. Morrison, facing complete public disgrace and armed with clear documentary evidence of his lies and their consequences, didn't fight the lawsuit. His lawyers negotiated a settlement within 6 weeks. The amount was substantial, not millions, but enough that Mary could buy a modest house outright, live comfortably for the rest of her life without financial worry, and still have something meaningful to leave to grandchildren who'd had the courage to reach out to her after the truth emerged. Mary didn't buy anything fancy or impressive, just a small cottage on the outskirts of Riverside, with 2 bedrooms, a garden space, and excellent natural light for sewing. She started taking in alterations work again, and this time people came to her with respect rather than whispered judgment, with apologies rather than suspicious glances. The wedding dress, the one she'd never worn, the one her grandmother had used to preserve and hide truth, Mary had it professionally cleaned and preserved in a special archival frame. She hung it prominently on her living room wall as a daily reminder, not of what had been stolen from her, but of what she'd reclaimed through courage and evidence and refusing to stay silent. 7 months after the confrontation in the town square, Mary stood in her small garden planting roses in the spring sunshine. She was 76 now. She'd lost 40 years to lies and injustice. She'd been evicted by her own ungrateful children. She'd been homeless and desperate and forced to live in a basement. And through all of that, she'd saved herself. She'd found the truth her grandmother had preserved for her like seeds, waiting for the right season to finally grow. She'd stood up to power with nothing but evidence and dignity. She'd reclaimed her name and her reputation. She'd proven that even at 75, even starting with nothing, strength and truth could still triumph. The doorbell rang, interrupting her gardening. Mary wiped her hands on her apron and went inside, expecting perhaps a customer dropping off alterations. Instead, she found Michael standing on her porch, holding the hand of a small child, her great-granddaughter Emma, 7 years old, whom Mary had only met twice before at family gatherings where she'd been largely ignored. "Hi, Mum," Michael said, his voice nervous but genuinely hopeful. "I was hoping... Emma has been asking about you since she saw you on the news. She thinks you're incredibly brave, and she mentioned wanting to learn to sew like you do. So I was wondering if you had time this afternoon to maybe teach her some basics, if you're willing." Mary looked at her youngest son, saw genuine effort and real regret in his eyes, saw a great-granddaughter looking up at her with curious, admiring eyes that held none of the judgment or shame the older generation had carried. She thought about holding on to anger forever, about making them pay indefinitely for their failures. And then she thought about her grandmother, Eleanor, who'd preserved truth and evidence not out of vengeance but out of love, who'd protected Mary, even from beyond death, because that's what real love did. "Come in," Mary said, stepping aside to let them enter her home. Then, because forgiveness was also a form of strength, and because grudges hurt the person carrying them more than anyone else, "I'll teach Emma to sew, and while I do, I'll tell her the complete story of a wedding dress that held the truth for 40 years until it was finally needed. She should know where she comes from. She should understand what her great-great-grandmother did to protect me. She should learn that truth always matters, even when it takes decades to finally emerge. Michael nodded, tears visible in his eyes. Thank you, Mom, for giving us another chance, for being willing to let us try to earn back what we threw away. Mary smiled at little Emma, who was looking up at her with those wide, curious eyes. Come on, sweetheart. Let me show you something beautiful. Let me teach you how patient hands and careful work can create something that lasts. And let me tell you a story about why truth and dignity matter more than anything else in this world. I am deeply grateful you stayed with Mary Elizabeth Sullivan through her entire journey from being destroyed by lies to standing in truth and reclaiming her dignity after 40 years. If her story touched something deep in your heart, if you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, if you've carried the crushing weight of others' false judgment for years or decades, if you've wondered whether it's ever truly too late to clear your name and reclaim what was stolen, leave one word in the comments describing how you would feel if you finally, after all those years, proved your innocence to everyone who doubted you. Because Mary's story proves something powerful and universally true, that truth doesn't have an expiration date or a statute of limitations. That evidence preserved with love and intention can wait patiently for decades until the moment it's finally needed. That even at 75, even when you've lost absolutely everything, even when your own children have abandoned you, you can still fight for justice and win. That dignity and self-respect don't come from what others think of you, but from standing up for yourself and speaking truth even when no one else will stand beside you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that reputations can be restored, that lies don't have to be the final word written about us, that sometimes the darkest and most desperate moments in our lives lead directly to the most powerful vindication and triumph. Because together we prove that dreams don't age, truth doesn't fade with time, and it's never too late to take back what was stolen from you and stand fully in the light of your own integrity and courage. Welcome to our family of people who refuse to let lies and false accusations define them forever. Welcome to our community of warriors who know that patience and truth and evidence will ultimately triumph over power and deception. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age.